Yes. In any event, it is time I ask you all to mute your mics, please. It's 7:30, and we are about to begin the 799th regular meeting of the Civil War Roundtable. I remind you all, perhaps you don't need any reminding, today is also Abraham Lincoln's 212th birthday, so we should be mindful of that. Tonight we have a very special program in my mind, something I've been waiting for a long time. I've been waiting to meet this lady for a long time. More recently, 2013, when I attended a lecture, we all did, those of us who were on the Antietam tour, we heard a nice lecture from Gordon Dahman on the efforts of Dr. Letterman in Civil War medicine. And during that lecture, I was caused to think like, well, what about Clara Barton? She was here. She was out on the battlefield. And I guess I sort of dropped it from there, but and didn't do much homework on Clara Barton, but I've always thought I would like to meet Clara Barton. And we're about to, and I'm kind of excited about that, because as I tried to find out more about Clara Barton, and I must admit I never did learn as much as I should have. She has an impressive life, that's for sure. And I will not mention anything about her life because she can tell her story better than I can. But we know this much. She was a great hero of the Civil War. And she achieved much after the Civil War as well. I should say that I am, just on a very private note, she and I have something in common, two things in common, as a matter of fact. My mother was a nurse and my son is a nurse. And also, her favorite color was red, and so is mine. Now, I hope she doesn't mind that I've revealed that very intimate piece of information, but I felt kind of good about that. But while I will not recite her many achievements, one thing I learned about Clara Barton, which makes her the outstanding person she is that she knew how to help people in distress. Her abilities went far beyond merely tending to people's wounds, to soldiers' wounds. She understood the spiritual and emotional sides of human nature and the needs of soldiers. She called them her soldier boys, and took care of those needs as well: food, clothing, shelter, etc. A remarkable woman, and she was admired by many. I have one quote that I dug up, and which I think is very apt. After the battle at Antietam, a surgeon on who either observed her activities or who was told about them, his name was James Dunn, said, "In my feeble estimation, General McClellan, with all his laurels, sinks into insignificance beside the true heroine of the age, the angel of the battlefield." Well, that's what she's known as, and I am very honored to introduce her. From Cedar Mountain to Antietam to Fredericksburg to Cold Harbor and Petersburg, all the way to Andersonville, the angel of the battlefield, Clara Barton.
Thank you. And it looks like we've got someone's screen share up. I'm getting Scott McIlvain. Is that you? If you are able to go up to the top of the screen. Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right. That should do it a little bit better. So I also want to thank everyone for coming, and I am so delighted all of you have brought donations for the boys with you. I might do some sorting as we talk. For those of you who brought onions, I especially thank you. I think it's shocking how difficult it is for our boys to get fresh vegetables. You and I might not crave raw onions, but believe me, the soldiers do. They get so little fresh produce and they crave it so much. Usually all they get are the Army's dried vegetables, desiccated vegetables they're called. You know what the soldiers call them? Desecrated vegetables. Now, lemons are nice, but they're best by the whole box. Soldiers get very little citrus, and they need it desperately. I have seen a wounded man clutch at a lemon the way a child would an orange. And bread is good. Now, be aware, it will take several months to get to the boys, so it will be moldy when it arrives, but they'll just cut the moldy parts off and eat it. That's fine. And soap is desperately needed for obvious reasons. And bandages are perhaps the most important thing we can do for our boys. Of course, it's best if you bring them to us already rolled. You all know how to roll bandages, right? What you do is find fabrics. Tablecloths work well, or sheep, or petticoats if women have any. Tear them into thin strips. 2 inches wide is a good width for most wounds, but make some about 1 inch. That's more useful for finger and toe wrappings. Start with a very tight roll at the top and roll them, keeping the ends as even as possible. That allows as many rolls of bandages to be stacked into a box as possible. Did I mention your fingers will get tired after doing this for a while? You can wash the fabrics beforehand, but it's not absolutely essential. Give me, you all did not come here to learn how to roll bandages. My topic today is the life of Miss Clara Barton. All right, I was born Christmas Day, 1821. It must have been a surprise to my parents. They already had 4 children, 2 girls, 2 boys, all of them at least 10 years older than I was. Do any of you have older brothers or sisters? Did they ever tease you and make fun of you? This is what mine did. My older brothers teased me mercilessly. I remember once my older brother Stephen asked me if I could name some of the stars up in the sky. And I remember saying to him, "The Big Dipper? You mean like a spoon in the sky? Well, I've never seen a spoon in the sky. I don't know where it is, but I'm only 4 years old." For me, it was like having 6 parents instead of just 2. But the good part was they taught me things. Stephen taught me how to ride a horse. I could ride a horse bareback by the time I was 5 years old. My sister, Sally, she taught me how to spell. I was spelling artichoke before I was even in school. My brother David taught me all about math. It was David, in fact, who gave me my first and only experience in nursing before the war. When I was 11, David was 21. He and our father were building a barn, and the pole that was holding up the loft where he was standing suddenly snapped. He fell right to the ground, broke multiple bones. The doctors came, they couldn't seem to heal him. He developed a fever. The doctors actually thought his life was over, but I didn't. I vowed I would be the one to get him back to health. So I learned how to put cold compresses on his head, gave him medications when he was ill. Most of the medications we had at that time was opium, which always made him sleep, seemed to do him good, but did not cure him. And I learned how to put leeches on. Now, if there is one thing I hate, it's leeches, just slimy, ugly bugs. But of course, these were the days when we believed that a leech could cure a sick person. Leeches suck blood. We believed that if enough of the sick blood was sucked out of a person, they would be cured. It's ridiculous, I know, but this is what we believed. In the 2 years that David was sick, I became an expert at putting leeches on him and then getting them off when they were done. If you hold a leech in place long enough, it will suck blood and then fall off naturally, or you can stick your fingernail under the edge to pop it off. all cured. I was glad when David got better, but I sort of missed taking care of him. I liked that feeling of being needed. It was not long after that, of course, my mother thought I should think about getting married, but I knew that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to do something on my own. I wanted to be useful and make a difference. But of course, there was not very much that a girl could do in those days. There were certainly no female nurses, not even very many hospitals. About the only option open for me was to teach. All right, I can do it. No, I'm too shy. No, I can do it. No, yes, all right. It was my first day teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. I was 16 years old. 60 pupils sat in front of me. I had no idea what to do. I finally just picked up a book.
That's me.
And started reading from it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form. Darkness covered everything.
My one downstairs is full screen.
All of them listened. And out in the yard, as they were playing, some of the older boys started getting rowdy. I went over, picked up a ball, and joined their game. Remember, I had 4 older siblings. I knew how to play. They were impressed at how well I could throw. Maybe being a teacher is not so difficult after all. So for the next 10 years or so, I taught on and off. And then I happened to be visiting a friend of mine who was living in New Jersey. And I noticed all these children simply wandering around this town. When I met one of the school board members, I said to him, Mr. Sidham, I notice many children in your town do not attend school. Well, I'm sure there are good private schools, but what do you do for the children whose parents cannot afford that? You know there is a law requiring you to provide free public education for every student. I'll tell you what, I'm a teacher. If the school board will establish a free public school, I will stay and teach for no pay, just room and board. You might not like it, but it's the law. I'll be back tomorrow to hear your answer. Mr. Sidham turned out to be a good man deep down. He convinced the school board to open up the first free public school in the state of New Jersey. First day of class, I had 40 pupils. By the end of the year, I had 400. And not long after that, the school board built a brand new school building and established the paid position of principal. And would you believe I was not given the job? They gave it to a man instead. I, of course, immediately quit. I might sometimes be willing to work for nothing, but if anyone is paid at all, I will never do a man's job for less than a man's pay. I did not realize it at the time, but that was the end of my teaching career. So now what do? Well, I went to visit my sister, who is now married and living in the city of Washington. Have you been ever to Washington? If you have, you know, it's just a frontier town. Most of the roads are unpaved. The buildings are just wooden blocks. But I found a position in the United States Patent Office. First woman they ever hired. $14 was my salary. Of course, the other clerks resented me. They called me a pest in petticoats. They would take their cigars and blow smoke in my face. They spit tobacco juice on my shoes. I just ignored them. I might have been terrified, but I never let it show. Besides, there were bigger problems facing the country by this point. By this point, slavery had deeply divided our nation. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, several southern states decided to pull away, start their own country. And Mr. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 100,000 men to sign up as soldiers. The city of Washington began to fill up with troops. I heard that a train carrying some soldiers from Massachusetts had arrived in town. It had taken them a week to get by railroad from Boston to Washington. They had been attacked while they were crossing through the city of Baltimore. I, of course, rushed down to the railroad station. Excuse me, Sergeant, I'm looking for a train with some Massachusetts soldiers on it. Do you know? Are any of them from the 6th Massachusetts? I might know some of them. They're right from Worcester. That's where I'm from. Oh, thank you. Several friends and I made our way through the crowd and found the soldiers from Massachusetts, including a young man named Simon, who had been one of my students growing up. Simon, last time I saw you, you were just a kid working on the farm near David's place. We heard how awful it was for you in Baltimore. We were shocked. We'll come and see you. Where are they taking you? To the United States Capitol? Are you sure? The city of Washington was unprepared for all these soldiers, so there was not enough barrack space. Any available government building was being used, including the United States Capitol. All right, we'll come and meet you. What do you need? They needed everything. Their luggage had disappeared in those riots in Baltimore, and they had nothing, not even extra shirts. Some of them did not have a clean handkerchief. So we, of course, emptied our pockets and then went home and filled a box with all sorts of spoons and forks and buttons and threads, string candles. At the last minute, I tossed in a copy of our hometown newspaper, the Worcester Spy. When we got to the United States Senate chamber where these boys were, they asked me to read the newspaper for them. So I perched on the only available spot, the desk of the president of the Senate, and I read them the entire newspaper out loud. As I was walking home, an idea came to me. What if I wrote to the Spy? What if I asked their readers, the people of Worcester County, to send me food and supplies for their own boys, or money so I could buy the things their own boys needed? The response staggered me. Boxes began flooding in. Ladies' aid societies and sewing circles, church groups, so many supplies came in. I barely had room to sort them. I remember watching in June of 1861 as our boys marched off to the new Confederate capital in Richmond. For 4 days, this continuous line of soldiers marching out of the city, brave, gallant, handsome boys, apparently lacking nothing, and behind them, a happy crowd of picnickers. They wanted to see a war. They had gone maybe 20 miles when the new Confederate army met up with them near a little creek, Bull Run, and they were ruinously defeated. We had to watch as our shattered army came staggering back into the city. It was clear to me immediately how inadequate our army supply system was. At that battlefield, absolutely inadequate medical supplies and help. This terrible lack of supplies and preparation, very little effort to help the wounded men until they arrived back in Washington several days later, and then more waiting until they could be taken somewhere. I was there. I saw them. Flies swarming over open wounds, these pitiful cries for water. Those men should have been helped immediately on the battlefield, not days or weeks later. I had the supplies. I decided I could be the one to start bringing them the help they needed. Except it was unheard of in those days for a woman to go by herself to a battlefield. A single woman alone among rough men? Shocking. I'm ashamed to tell you this, but I struggled long and hard with my sense of propriety. What would people think? Would my reputation be ruined? But as the fighting continued and the casualty numbers kept mounting, I set aside my fear. I decided I had to go to the front. All I needed were some wagons and men to carry the wagons and permission to get through the lines. I went to see the head of the quartermaster depot, Colonel Daniel H. Rucker. He sat at a desk behind a little railing with a gate. The office was full of male orderlies, all of them looking busy and important. It brought out all my bashfulness. My hands began to sweat and my cheeks grew flushed. Finally, Colonel Rucker turned to me. Well, what do you want? I want to go to the front. Front? No, that's no place for a lady. There's going to be a battle. I know. I'm not afraid of a battle. Why? Have you got father or brother there? No, I have no one there. But I have some things I'd like to bring to the boys. Well, what sort of things? Oh, not just delicacies, real food. I have pickled vegetables and meats and medical supplies, bandages, sheets, bed shirts, linens. Where is it all? Oh, it's in my home, sir, and in my 3 warehouses. 3 warehouses? Good heavens! He was astonished and immediately wrote me out permission. Miss C.H. Barton has permission to go upon any government transport and pass through any lines and bridges for the purposes of bringing comfort and aid to the boys. When we heard not long after that our soldiers had clashed again at a place called Cedar Mountain, I decided it was time. We packed up our supplies and we rushed to the front. What we found there made us shudder in horror. Men were lying on the ground, some of them covered in blood and unable to move. Some of them had had arms and legs blown off in the fighting. I was shocked, but even though all my life I have always been terribly bashful, I had no hesitation at helping these boys. We worked for 2 days and 3 nights with barely any sleep, nursing the boys, bringing them to warmth inside churches and schools and barns. I knew this was what I was destined to do. A surgeon who was working there wrote a letter home. His son sent it to me many years later. At a time when we were out of supplies of all kinds, she provided us with everything. And while the bullets were flying, she stayed, seeing soup prepared and handing out shirts to the boys. I thought that night that if heaven ever sent out a homely angel, she must be one. Not sure I care for that word, homely. Let's change it, shall we? How about holy? I thought that night, if heaven ever sent out a holy angel, she must be one. I think that's much better, don't you? At the Battle of Chantilly, we worked in the midst of pouring rain, handing out what little food supplies we had. You know what it was that time? Hard army crackers that we put into haversacks and then pounded into crumbs with rocks and stirred into a mixture of wine and water and brown sugar. Not very appetizing, no, but I can assure you, every bite of it was eaten by those starving men. Another time, we came upon at least 200 six-mule army wagons crowded with wounded men and sunk up to the hubs in mud. A surgeon was watching me, and a young chaplain came up and stood next to us. He said to me, "Madam, do you think that those wagons have wounded men in them?" "I'm quite sure they do. Don't you agree?" The surgeon agreed with us. So the chaplain said, "Well, what do you think we should do for them?" "Well, we could start by feeding them. I hear some of them have gone as long as 34 hours with no food or water." "Well, we have some clothes and plenty of reading materials, but no food in any quantity except army crackers." "Well, I have coffee, so hot coffee and crackers it'll have to be." We built a fire, brewed up big pots of hot coffee. I showed him how to tie a tablecloth around his waist, because then you can tuck the ends in and use it as an apron to carry the crackers and still keep both hands free for coffee. We filled up our aprons, picked up the pots of coffee, and made our way down the slope to the edge of this muddy basin. Here the chaplain stopped and he said to me, "How are we supposed to get to them? There's all this mud." "No way that I can see except to walk." And I think he thought that I was mad, but I simply lifted up my skirts and stepped right into the mud. And I'm very proud to tell all of you that this young man picked up his apron and took his first real steps into military life. People talk about transporting supplies as if it were just easiest thing imaginable to transport supplies several hundred miles across a country, always under threat of attack from snipers. Do you know how long a train of army supply covered wagons is? It can be several miles, and the order is always the same. First, the wagons with ammunition, then the wagons with food and supplies for the healthy troops, and finally, medical supplies. We could no more change this order than we could go up in the sky and change the position of a star. But according to this order, in case of a battle, medical supplies might arrive 2 or 3 days after the battle. I decided we needed a new plan. So one night, we stopped early, found a resting place, and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, when everything was dark, we got up, ate, harnessed, and moved on past the whole line. By daylight, we had gone about 10 miles, and we were up ahead of the ammunition. By nightfall that day, we had caught up with the Army of the Potomac. We knew where to go because soldiers, always sing as they march. So we listened for the sound of their singing. It was quiet in the morning and got louder as we got closer. So it was sort of like, "John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on." Can you see why we felt such pride in our soldiers? 80,000 men marching on to meet the enemy and save our Union. That night, I was so energized, I could not sleep. I woke up at about 2 a.m. and went outside in the yard. The moon was shining through the clouds, casting moving shadows over thousands and thousands of soldiers' tents. All I could think was, thy will, oh God, thy will be done. I'm sure that many of you have never heard a bugle waking you in the morning. When I heard it that morning as it rang through the camp, you will know why I hear it to this day. That morning, as expected, an enormous battle started far off in the distance. We used field glasses and we could barely see our boys falling back. I knew our place was there, so we followed them. During the last few miles, we met hundreds of wounded men walking or being carried to the rear. Finally, we stopped in a cornfield near a little farmhouse with a barn. The fighting here had to have been horrific because around that barn lay about 300 wounded men, the ones too badly wounded to even be moved. And it was not yet 10 o'clock. As I went in the gate to the little farmhouse's yard, a surgeon, Dr. Dunn from Philadelphia, nearly ran into me. My God, he said, how did you get here so quickly from Virginia? And you have supplies? Do you know we have nothing but our instruments and what little chloroform we brought? We have torn up the last rag, the last sheet we can find in the house. There are no bandages left, and all these men bleeding to death. Surgeons were hard at work in every room of that farmhouse, removing bullets and sawing off limbs, which were then casually tossed out the front door. At the foot of a tree, just in front of the house, a heap of feet and legs and arms stood. I remember by the end of the day, it was several feet tall. On the porch were 4 tables. Each one had a wounded man on it with a surgeon standing over him and a pile of green corn leaves beside them. They were using corn leaves as bandages. I was so overwhelmingly grateful that I had supplies. Oh, be grateful for all those boxes of bandages that you rolled, of medications that you packed up for you that day. Those men gave thanks and blessings. 3 times that day, the battle came to that little farmhouse. Twice more, our boys were driven back and then pushed forward again. Each time, hundreds of wounded men joined us. We were so close to the battle, and the fighting grew so intense, rebel shells exploded right over our heads. We could hear them crashing into the trees outside. Bullets peppered the upper floor of that farmhouse until it was riddled with holes. By noon, the smoke was so thick, we could not see more than a few feet in front of us. The hot breath of sulfur dried out our lips until they bled. At one point, as I was walking through the yard, a soldier lying on the ground asked me, please, a drink of water. So I went and fetched him some water in an invalid cup. I lifted up his head with my left hand, and with my right hand, I held the cup of water to his lips. Suddenly, I felt a twitch in my sleeve, and the soldier jerked back. A mini ball had ripped through my sleeve and slammed into him, killing him instantly. There was nothing more I could do for him, so I covered him up, and left. You know, I have never mended that hole in my sleeve. I sometimes wonder if soldiers ever mend the bullet holes in their sleeves. The way these men could endure pain. Just outside the barn was a soldier with a mini ball under his cheek. The bullet had entered on one side and had ended up under the nerves and tissues of his other cheek. He gave me this imploring look, so I went over. What is it? Oh, is it terribly painful? Oh no, I could not possibly get it out myself. Let me fetch a surgeon for you. I'm sure one can come for you. Oh, no, not immediately, but eventually. All right, if the pain is that difficult, I will get it out. This was a new call. I had never before cut into human flesh. I found a pocket knife and brought it over. I cannot possibly hurt you so much. He gave me as much of a smile as his mangled face could manage and told me I could not possibly hurt him. He could stand any pain that my hands created. How could I ignore a cry like that? So I opened up the blade of my pocket knife and I prepared. Sitting on the ground nearby was a young sergeant from Illinois who had been watching us this entire time. When he saw me start to prepare with no one to help, he said he would help and managed to sit up. He shoved himself along the ground, took this young man's head in his hands and held it while I cut that bullet out and then washed and bandaged up the face. I do not think any surgeon would have pronounced it a very scientific operation, but he was so grateful that I dared to hope at least it was a success. At about 2:00, my men came to say that the last loaf of bread had been served, the last cracker had been eaten. There was no food left. Oh, what to do? Do we have any boxes of that medical wine left? All right, open up that and give the boys the wine, and heaven forgive us. What is it? To our astonishment, the women who had packed up these bottles of wine that was to be used for medicinal purposes, they had run out of the sawdust that they were using as packing material. The last few boxes had been packed instead in finely sifted cornmeal. Cornmeal! If it had been gold nuggets, we would not have felt any richer. I looked around at my men and they were all surreptitiously wiping their eyes. We went back to work in silence. We found several big kettles and set them up over fires, stirring up a hot gruel. And all that night, my men carried buckets of hot gruel for miles down the line to the dead and dying still lying right where they had fallen. As darkness fell, I told my men to get candles out of the wagons and set up lanterns in the house and the barn. Then I went into the house to see what I could do. There was a surgeon lying there holding a tiny piece of tallow candle. I said to him, "You look tired, doctor." "Tired?" "Yes, I am tired. I am tired of such heartlessness, such carelessness. Here are at least 1,000 wounded men, terribly wounded. 500 of them will not live to morning without help. And this, several inches of candle, it's all I have. It's all I can get. How am I supposed to endure this?" "Doctor," I said, "come here. Look, you see that? The barn is lit, and the house will be too, quite soon." He looked out the window with me and said, "But how? Who did this?" "I did." "Well, where did you get them all?" "I brought them with me." How many have you got?" "Many." dozens, 4 boxes of candles. He was so overwhelmed, he could not even speak. All that night we worked and hoped and prayed, but it was only in the light of the next day, as we looked out across that battlefield, that we fully realized at what a fearsome cost our boys had won the Battle of Antietam. And for me, it was only weeks later on the train going back to Washington that I finally looked at myself, tired, ragged, blood-stained, gloveless, this sense of desolation and pity and weariness all blended together swept over me. The cost of this war, the desolation and the anguish and the want that have spread over our country since this war began. 23,000 dead or wounded in one day at Antietam. 300,000 dead in 1 year. Dead everywhere, on every battlefield they lie, in the crowded yards of every prison ground, under the waves of the ocean, and at the roadside where the tired soldier simply lay down with his knapsack and his gun and died of exhaustion. In all these strange beds, our soldiers lie. The fields of Virginia and many other battlefields are rich with their blood. And yet I feel such pride in our soldiers. There is something sublime about them. That victory at Antietam gave Mr. Lincoln the ammunition he needed to announce his Emancipation Proclamation, the beginning of the end of the war, which has plunged our nation into this great battle. I am a U.S. soldier. The Army of the Potomac is my army. As long as the soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and serve them. And now, if you'll all excuse me, I probably should go and get these supplies to the warehouses. I hope all of you will continue to work with me to do everything we can to help our brave boys in blue. Thank you, and good night.
It was great.
But don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. I want to take just about 5 or 10 minutes, if I could, at the end here. I'm going back. Maybe what I'll do is I'll take off my apron. I'm going to go back to being Leslie Goddard because I want to share with you, we're talking about the story of, this doesn't really help much, but it's a visual signal, right? I'm back to being Leslie Goddard because I want to take a couple of minutes and share with you very briefly what happened with Clara Barton in the Civil War after she established her work. Because to give you my background, I started doing this portrayal. Oh boy, it was a long time ago, probably about maybe 15 years ago. And at the time, the Office of Missing Soldiers had not yet been restored and opened up as a museum. And that's an important part of the story. So let me take just a few minutes because I want to share with you that part of the story. I'm not going to talk all about Clara Barton's the rest of her life, but I want to focus on this little piece of the story. Like a lot of people who were active in the American Civil War, she was born in the 1820s. We don't have a lot of photos of her as a young person for obvious reasons. We do have this photograph, which was taken when she was working as a teacher. And of course, more famously, we know her from things like the Matthew Brady photo. This is an image of Clara in 1865. Now, she was older than, if we watch Mercy Street, we might think of Civil War nurses as being rather young. She was actually 39 when the war broke out. So she was in her mid-40s at the end of the war. After Antietam, she continued to be active. She was in Fredericksburg in December of 1862. She spent a lot of 1863 in South Carolina. She was there at the time of when the 54th Massachusetts did its assault on Battery Wagner. In 1864, she came back to the Virginia Theater. She was active in the aftermath of Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. She took over a hospital in Petersburg, Virginia in the summer of 1864. But a lot of the work that she did supplying troops was gradually taken over by the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission. But her next big step happened in 1865, because that's when she was starting to look for what she was going to do next. She was out of things to do. She was out of things to help. And she struggled with depression all her life. And she was falling into a pretty serious bout of depression as the war is drawing to its close. She happened to be in Annapolis. She was assisting at the parole camp there. This was where survivors of prison camps from across the South, Union survivors, came to be sort of rehabilitated, any medical conditions taken care of before they are integrated either back into the war or back home. So Barton's there, and she's providing assistance to the soldiers who are coming in from places in the South, places like Andersonville, the famous prison in Georgia. And she was horrified by the condition of the soldiers coming back and the stories that they were telling. She'd heard about thousands of men who didn't survive Andersonville. And she knew that the Army had no established system to notify families if their loved ones happened to pass away in unknown conditions, which, being in a prisoner of war camp, it often was. No dog tags existed, and there was, if someone was wounded or killed, the U.S. Army had no mechanism to formally inform the families. They kind of relied on, officers or other enlisted men in the unit to notify the families. But if a soldier died in unknown conditions and nobody knew how to get in touch with the family members, and especially if he was buried in an unknown grave, the family would never be notified. She was very aware of this, and particularly hearing the numbers of deaths at Andersonville. And of course, the same thing happened at military camps, right? Prison camps. Men in prison camps were dying in droves. And no one, in many cases, informed the family. They might learn that parts of a unit were captured, but they might not learn whatever happened afterwards. So she's hearing stories. She's hearing stories about how atrocious the conditions are and about the thousands of men dying. And we know it was as many as 13,000, right, who died at Andersonville. Now, Barton, who was always very ambitious, realized this was an opportunity. This was an era when mourning was taken very seriously. Proper mourning was seen as not just your moral obligation, it was a Christian obligation. Not being able to properly mourn, to properly bury someone and mourn for them, was a tremendous emotional burden for Americans. So, in February of 1865, she starts a correspondence with folks around Abraham Lincoln trying to get approval to set up an office for assisting families locating missing soldiers. Now, she ran into a lot of problems doing this. First of all, she never was able to meet with Lincoln face to face. She went to the White House, we know, on at least 2 occasions. The president was too busy because, he had a war to run. And of course, the beginning of Reconstruction is looming over him at this point. But she did have powerful friends in Washington, particularly in a senator by the name of Henry Wilson, this powerful senator from her home state of Massachusetts. So she writes to Wilson. Wilson is able to communicate with Lincoln, saying what she wants to do. That is ultimately what led, in March of 1865, for him to approve Barton to begin the work of the Missing Soldiers Office. She sent out a press release to the Northern press to be published in newspapers saying, any families of missing Union soldiers, please write Clara Barton in Washington, D.C. on 7th Street. Give me your information about your loved one. And if any news comes in, I will be the conduit and that information will be distributed back to you. Now, when she began this, there's no indication she thought this was going to be a major effort. In fact, her brother passed away at about the same time, and she went for a week up to Massachusetts to deal with the burial and disposing of the estate. It took about a week. And when she came back, there were 300 letters from families. That's in 1 week's time. She realized this was not just a need, it was a pretty desperate need. So the work of the Missing Soldiers Office began in earnest. And the office came to occupy, going back to that, this image, by the way, which I love, this is from Harper's Weekly. What I love about this image is it really shows how, I mean, this is obviously not a formal Union federal cemetery, but the whole notion of being able to desperately looking for your loved one and wanting to have what we would today call closure was extremely important to families. Clara Barton, who was personally very ambitious in the best kind of way, right? She wanted to do something important, partly for her own sense of fulfillment, but she wanted something that would genuinely fulfill a need. This was the need that she had been waiting for. So when these families start writing in, she takes the information, name, unit, state the soldier is from, and that information was published onto lists these lists were then sent out to northern cities to be printed in newspapers, to be posted on, public bulletin boards, and all of them coming with a little note somewhere saying, if you recognize a name on this list, please write to Clara Barton, 488 7th Street, and she would send that information to the relatives. That in June of 1865, a young clerk by the name of Dorrance Atwater contacts her and asks her for the most up-to-date list of missing soldiers. Atwater, if you know the story of Andersonville, he had been a prisoner there. He'd been paroled to work in the hospital. And as he was keeping the log of deaths, he kept a copy of it for himself. In the summer of 1865, Atwater and Barton pour through the letters and begin searching for these missing soldiers in the Anderson death register and in the captured hospital records. So while laborers are working to set up headboards in the federal cemetery at Andersonville, Barton was writing dozens of letters informing families that their loved ones had died at Andersonville. And we know, that we have no photographs of what the Office of Missing Soldiers looked like. Here is the way it looks today in its restored situation. She took over what had been 3 separate boarding rooms at the boarding house where she was living and sort of took down the walls between them to create one larger space with just a tiny room at the end where she would sleep. She ultimately had to hire 10 clerks to work with her to do this work. She was not, by the way, independently wealthy. She did fundraising. She relied on gifts from family and friends, people who heard the work she was doing and wanted to support it. And that was true for all of her Civil War work. For the Missing Soldiers Office, she did pursue government money. It took her years before Congress appropriated $15,000 for the work she did. But until that happened, she fronted the funding needed with money she raised herself. She also traveled around the country giving speeches in 1866 and 1867. She gave lectures about what it was like to be a woman going to a battlefield. She was very proud of the fact that she had been at the front lines. Florence Nightingale had been absolutely working in a military hospital, but she was about 350 miles behind the front lines. Clara Barton had been on the front lines. So between speaking fees and her own fundraising, she cobbled the money together. Between 1865 and 1868, Clara Barton received more than 60,000 pieces of correspondence from families. That's about an average of 100 letters a day coming into her office. In total, she was able to locate about 22,000 missing Union soldiers. Now, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the large number of missing Union soldiers who essentially disappeared without a trace. And of that 22,000, about 13,000 were the men at Andersonville. That was a huge chunk of it. But nonetheless, it was for the families that she was able to assist, it was incredibly important. She went on an expedition to Andersonville in August of 1865 to when it became a national cemetery. She was one of the first to raise the American flag over the national cemetery there. She was enormously proud of the work she had done. But by 1868, she's in poor health. She always, all her life, she suffered from weak health. Her doctors told her she needed to take a break, so she packed up everything at the missing soldiers' office and left, eventually went on an extended visit to Europe. She actually was in Switzerland. She was actually staying with the family of one of the clerks at the missing soldiers' office. And it was in Switzerland that members of the International Committee of the Red Cross met with her. They wanted to meet the angel of the battlefield of the American Civil War. That is when she first heard about the Red Cross. She stayed in Europe, began working with the Red Cross, got wrapped up in the work for the Franco-Prussian War, and pretty much for the rest of her life, there is no rest. She got sucked into many other conflicts, many other humanitarian disasters, founded the American Red Cross in 1881, she was president of the American Red Cross until 1904, passed away in 1912 at the age of 91. Meanwhile, that building, which had been her boarding house, is in a neighborhood that goes on and becomes a very thriving neighborhood in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's an enormously popular shopping district. The building itself has a really popular shoe store on the bottom. It's all active until World War II. And after the war, with white flight and many Washington residents fleeing to the suburbs, the neighborhood starts to suffer. And then it really suffers after 1968, just to the north of this neighborhood. Huge swaths of Washington burned in the aftermath of the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. The building ultimately became empty at that point. The shoe store closed and the building was deserted until the 1990s, when the United States government got possession of it. Plans were for demolition, but because it was government owned, there had to be a survey done. And one of the last things to happen on Thanksgiving, day before Thanksgiving, 1996, a carpenter named Richard Lyons was doing a final review of the building. The building is about to be demolished, but he has to do a last review. So he goes in, checks out the first, is there any infrastructure damage, any trash, what's going on? Did the same thing on the second floor. Now the third floor, this is the staircase up to the third floor you're looking at here. The third floor had not changed for about 100 years. In 1911, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, there was this whole wave of fire safety regulation, and a lot of businesses, a lot of landlords decided they didn't want to pay to rehabilitate the whole building. So what this guy did was what many did. He just boarded up the third floor, rehabbed floors 1 and 2, and just left the third floor unoccupied. It was sometimes used for storage, but pretty much it was untouched. Lyons later told reporters when he went up to the third floor, it was dark. It had never been wired for electricity, no running water, nothing up there. He's coming down the stairs. He's essentially walking towards us in this photograph. But he hears a noise outside. So he goes to the windows in the front. This is actually Richard Lyons himself. There was a car accident out on 7th Street. So he went to look out the window and saw what was happening. He said, I was at the window and I felt like someone tapped me on the shoulder. And when I turned around, I happened to look up and I noticed an envelope between the ceiling and the wall. The space he was in had been Clara Barton's sleeping room, and there was a crawl space, the entry to a crawl space in the ceiling. So the envelope was flapping at that entry to the crawl space. So he got a ladder, reached in, pulled out an envelope. It was addressed to Edward Shaw, that had been Clara Barton's landlord. So he pokes around, pulls out some more things, including a sign that says, Missing Soldiers Office, 3rd story, room 9, Miss Clara Barton. He goes up there. He does what I never would have done and goes up there and finds about 1,000 artifacts. Lots and lots of letters to Shaw, but also to Clara Barton, things that she had abandoned when she left the building. There were utensils, Civil War era clothing. Here's some socks that were part of those artifacts. This immediately stops plans for demolition. It kicks off 2 decades of work to save what was in there, to make the building a museum. They have restored that 3rd floor and the 1st floor into the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum. In 2007, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine partnered up with the General Services the General Services Administration, the GSA, right? They run it. The GSA owns the building and the Civil War Medicine Museum runs it as a museum. So in 2015, the museum officially opened to the public. It is in the building you see here, the brick building with the green awnings. How convenient. There was a Starbucks right there. They could just go. So now you can actually take a guided tour. What's amazing to me about it is that this building is really where the transformation happened, where Clara Barton went from being a patent office clerk to doing her Civil War work. We know that she had a boarding, this was the boarding house she lived in during the Civil War between battlefield engagements, and it's later where she did that work with the missing soldiers. It's a phenomenal discovery. So if some of you might have already been there, so I apologize, but the image behind me, in case you're wondering, is sort of a reconstructed idea of what the Missing Soldiers Office might have looked like. So, all right, why don't I stop jabbering at that point? Because I want to open it up for questions, if anyone has any.
I'm sure people do. I have several myself, but I usually wait for the questions from others to be exhausted. So I see there are 7 here. So can you see them?
I see you. Are you talking about in chat?
Yes.
Yes, I do. In fact, I see comments and I see there is a question from Susan saying, after the war, did Clara go back to work in the patent office? No, she did not.
Yeah,
very interesting reason. She actually lost her job in the patent office when President Buchanan came into office. She had gotten the job initially prior to Buchanan's administration. Buchanan eliminated her job. It's suspected in part because of the fact that she was a woman. She did continue to work, but basically it was piecework. She would get, I think she got like 10 cents for every 100 words that she copied. She was sort of a human copy machine. It was not until Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president that her job was reinstated. So no, she didn't. And after the war, she hadn't really decided what to do. I don't think she wanted to go back to work in the patent office. I think what she wanted was to do something, to continue the work she'd done. She also, by the way, initially when she was first serving in the war effort, the patent office hired someone to replace her at half of her salary and sent half of her salary to her. That was what was often done for government employees. But after a little while, they stopped that, and she was infuriated that they weren't still giving her that half. So she was pretty much done with the patent office at that point. So, yeah. Different Carol asked, what was her cause of death? Believe it or not, it was complications from a cold, of all things, of all the things that she survived and went through. She was actually, it's really interesting, given that she was not in terribly good health. In fact, when she was 5 years old, she suffered a bout of dysentery. I mean, the thing that many soldiers suffered from. And some doctors who came to look her over when she was 5 thought she was never going to survive. The fact that she did was remarkable, and the fact that she lived as long as she did is really powerful testimony. She was always having breakdowns. Every time she was at a battlefield, she would come back home and it would be weeks till she got her strength back. So it really is truly remarkable.
She also was ill in South Carolina, correct?
Yes, she was. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, 1863 was an interesting year for her in many, many ways. Question from Lou. You mentioned Clara was cooking the cornmeal. She found several pots. Where did she find the pots if she was on a battlefield? She actually was working in a home. It was not uncommon for when a battle began, it was not uncommon for the military to take over nearby houses and, use whatever they happened to find in the house. So there were probably, now many people would, bury things before they left or take things with them. But in that particular case, there were big kettles left there. I mean, when you think about it today, with the kind of distribution systems that the United States military has today, it's so staggering to think the conditions that they were working in, leaving all of that to, in some ways, happen chance, right? Scott asks, what is it like to be possessed by the person you're portraying? What supernatural effects have you experienced while researching Clara Barton? That's such a fun question. For those of you, if you're not familiar, I do portrayals of about 8 or 9 different women. So I do not only Clara Barton, but I portray Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt, and I do Louisa May Alcott and Jackie Kennedy, really wide range of different women. This is actually one of the earliest portrayals I ever put together because I've always been fascinated by her. But it's really funny because some characters lend themselves more to this kind of thing than others. I always find with Clara, a lot of these stories are actually her own. I mean, I try to use primary resources whenever I can. Clara Barton never wrote a full autobiography, but some of the stories come from, she wrote the story of my childhood, and we have stories that she told in her speeches, and she was a really good storyteller. I mean, she wasn't necessarily, a great writer of the age, but she was a very powerful storyteller. That story, for example, of the doctor looking at a piece of candle, that comes right out of one of her speeches. In fact, apparently at one of her speeches, the doctor was there and came up to say, I'm sorry, I never thanked you for doing that. But she's emotional, and that always helps when you're doing this kind of a thing. I don't know. Yeah, I'm fortunate. By the way, my background is I have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in theater, and then I got my Ph.D. in history. So it's really kind of a blending of what I do. And my work experience, before I started doing portrayals and lectures full time, I actually worked in the museum field. So it's kind of an outgrowth of all of that. In fact, when I went to see this museum but this is a virtual backdrop if you haven't guessed. But when I first toured this office, I remember feeling this, not necessarily like I thought there were ghosts, but I felt like history in this very palpable way. It was exciting to be there. And I think that's just because of the fact that it's so unaltered from what it was. There's something about artifacts, those socks with the bloodstains on them, what they would often do, because there were no machines that could knit socks at the time, they would often take socks where the soles had worn off, and they would cut the sole off and keep the cuff and just, pick up new stitches and knit a new sole. Those cuffs that they found were probably waiting to have new soles knit for them, or were discarded as part of that. Sorry, anyway. Question, did the American Red Cross participate in the Spanish-American War? Yes, they did. Interestingly enough, when the American Red Cross was founded, 1881, one of the things that Clara Barton did was to add in that the Red Cross would assist in conditions of natural disasters and other places where relief was needed. It had been founded as an organization to provide assistance in wartime. But Clara Barton, perhaps recognizing, there's not going to be that, there are not that many wars and there's a lot of help we can do. She was the one who urged that. And it was eventually added into the International Red Cross. It's the American Amendment. So really, her work for the Red Cross was primarily for natural disaster relief until the Spanish-American War broke out. And she did absolutely participate. There's photographs of her down there. She was in, I'd have to go back and look it up. I believe she was in Cuba, but I'd have to go back. She, of course, by that point was much older, and there was some political infighting in the Red Cross, as there is in any group, right? But there was a feeling that she was very good when the Red Cross was young. She was not very good as an efficient administrator as it grew into a much larger organization. She liked to work one-on-one. Brian asked, Clara's supply network that she created, all done by donations, how large was the staff she had during the war? Most of it was done by donations, yes. And the amount of military provisioning that was done through private civilian sources always blows my mind when it comes to the American Civil War. What I didn't realize until I started doing this research was that there were a lot of charitable organizations already in place. Any small town of any, substantial size by the 1840s, 1850s had some kind of organization to benefit the poor. They had the church aid society. They were often called ladies' aid societies. So when the war began, and particularly with women who wanted to help, it was pretty easy for those groups to kind of pivot and become, a soldiers' aid society fairly quickly. And the networks grew up pretty darn quickly and, eventually structured into things like the Sanitary Commission. But they were always reliant on donations. And she in particular was, she liked to work by herself. She never affiliated with the Sanitary Commission. So she liked to advocate, request donations herself, have her own warehouses. Obviously, that limited the amount of supply that she could provide. Now, as far as, say, her assistants, a lot of those were provided by the government. Would often hire civilians to do things like driving the wagons to bring provisions to the front. But many times they were other volunteers. Very often they were simply other women who wanted to assist and heard by, whatever word of mouth means that Barton needed help. Barton was always very proud of the fact, though, that often they would get scared and leave when a battle was approaching, and she would stay till the very last minute. She was very, I keep coming back to the word ambitious, and it's accurate. I mean, she wanted to be important, and that was good in that, that was what drove her to do remarkable things. But it also limited her because she never affiliated herself or grew the organization, certainly not during the war. Question from John, what museum do you work in and which characters do you enjoy portraying the most? I no longer work in a museum. I work for a number of mostly local historical societies. I worked at the Evanston History Center for a while and the Elmhurst Historical Museum. I worked with the Francis Willard House for a while. I worked actually with the Morton Arboretum in their exhibition department. But now I am self-employed. I do presentations like this full time. So I am enormously grateful for Zoom in the last year and a half, because a lot of my work has shifted to virtual now. So characters I enjoy the most, that's like, it'll sound trite, but it's like choosing your favorite child, It tends to be whoever I'm working on at the moment. Most of the characters I choose because there's something about that person that I find very compelling. With Barton, I was really interested in, she's such a role model that's held up for children, but she's not often seen seriously by Civil War historians, which I understand. I mean, the contributions that she made individually are pretty small compared to, what the Sanitary Commission and Christian Commission did. But on the other hand, there's probably no other person in that era who worked so powerfully as the individual conduit between the home front and the battlefield. And in terms of that sort of breaking through the boundaries of both what her own personal character was, she was extremely shy, and yet very ambitious at the same time, and the way she was able to achieve that is remarkable. I always think her great legacy might not, with the Civil War, might not actually be in actually what she did as much as in the kind of role model that she can be for us looking back in history. Susan asked, did Clara ever marry or have children? She did not marry. Although there was always these rumors of love affairs. In fact, I was just reading today about how, I forgot there had been rumors about her and Henry Wilson for a while, which is really remarkable. He was married. By all accounts, she did have quite an amorous relationship with Colonel John Elwell. He was the quartermaster in South Carolina when she was there, and he was married. And by all accounts, they had quite a passionate relationship. Why she didn't marry is probably she never talked about it. Most historians will argue it was because she had this drive to achieve, and it was very difficult in those days for a woman to both have a high-powered career in the public sphere and to be a wife and a mother. So no, she never married, no children. There are descendants, however, through her other siblings. You know, she came from a family with 5 kids in it. So I believe 3 of her siblings have descendants who are still alive. I'd have to look that up, but I believe they do. Yeah, so there you go. Janet says, who accompanied Clara when she went to the battlefield? Very often it was other female volunteers, just women who wrote to her and said, I'd love to help. Let me know when you're going to the battlefield. And then they would just show up. It was very informal. Now, when she needed for example, a man, there were a huge number of male civilians hired by the government, and some of them would be routed to her. And they very often made no secret of the fact that they resented being assigned to work with a woman. She was very proud of the fact that she was often able to win them over, but it was not easy at all to be working, especially when you consider the fact that they were essentially being paid by the government. She was not, although the money that she got after the war did somewhat balance it out. It's very complicated. Karen says, did she ever meet Florence Nightingale or Walt Whitman? Not that I have ever come across, no. I've seen a number of posters that were made for her lectures that refer to her as the Florence Nightingale of the West, or of the Americas. But I've never come across any sign that they met. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think they ever did. Nor have I ever come across any sign that she met Whitman, which, you know, is much more likely because they were both New Englanders and he had served as she did. Now, the challenge is that Whitman didn't always have the most respect for women. You might remember he was very if you know about Whitman, he was very disdainful of Louisa May Alcott, who wrote her experiences about serving as a Civil War nurse. He wrote his own experiences about serving as a Civil War nurse, which he considered far superior to Louisa May Alcott's amusement. I would have to go back and see if she ever met Whitman. I'm not recalling it at the moment. She did. She was very, though, in touch with a lot of very high-powered circles because she was enormously well-known. And when she went on the lecture circuit, she attracted very large audiences. She was very active in other women's organizations in particular. So she certainly was appearing often with Susan B. Anthony, and she was never she supported women's suffrage. She was never an active suffragist, in that she worried that, because she always felt that she had this connection to men, and she worried that suffrage groups were a little bit too, gang up on the men. So that's oversimplified, but in some ways a kernel of truth. Did she have any dealings with Dorothea Dix? Not really. She really did not like Dorothea Dix, partly because Dix wanted to be as famous as Barton was. No, she absolutely did not. In fact, the only official work that she did, Dix was in charge of the union nurses for the most of the Union armies, right? Not just the Army of the Potomac. But Barton was never, well, with one exception, she was once assigned to be matron of a particular hospital. And that was through Henry Wilson's work. But that was about it. The rest of the stuff she did, she liked to work on her own and not be affiliated with any one official. Dix was working officially as to recruit nurses and train nurses and supply hospitals with the needed nursing staff. So no, they didn't at all. Of course, it's funny, in Clara Barton's writings, she's always willing to take a good story and make it much better. So she was matron of this one hospital, but in her writings it became she was head of all nurses for the Union Army. Same thing when she was writing about the school that she worked at. She said by the end of the year we had like 400 students. It was probably like 200. But she did that regularly. There's a certain insecurity, which is almost charming if it weren't annoying. But this insecurity that makes her want to puff up her reputation even more than she really needed to, because what she was doing really was remarkable. It really did take courage and going against gender norms. And it really remains to this day a great role model. What do you see as her greatest influence in advancement of the profession of nursing? You know, that's such a great question, because when she was referred to as a nurse, she would always say she wasn't really a nurse. She was more of a supplier, right? She was bringing supplies to the troops. It just happened that there was nursing that needed to be done. And, you know, she would have always said, though, that it was during the war that the need to have female nurses became apparent. And that was what many people were saying, right? Because this really was the first war where you had women serving in frontline battlefield soldiers in a way that risked their reputation, but that turned out to be providing phenomenally important work, right? She was not necessarily an advocate in any kind of a formal way for women as nursing. So it wasn't anything that she specifically was fighting for, but I think she was one of the most visible of what were thousands of women who demonstrated that women could play a really critical role in the field of nursing, that having, you know, recovering soldiers assist with changing bandages on soldiers in a hospital who were worse off, that was not an efficient way to help soldiers heal. That mindset is what led very quickly after the Civil War to the establishment of professional schools for nursing training in the United States, and ultimately the opening up of nursing as a career for women. So it was much more in what she did as a role model than in anything that she was necessarily advocating for herself. So, all right. Well,
I have questions.
Yeah.
I was waiting for everybody else to finish. I had several questions, sort of in kind of chronological order. Was Clara Barton, I mean, did she come by her abolitionism basically based on, you know, her place of birth as a New Englander?
In a way, yes. I mean, her father was, she came from an abolitionist family. And this was a family that, like a lot of Massachusetts residents, they were well-educated. They were involved in a number of progressive causes. Her father had been a captain in the military. He was very supportive of her work to go to war. In fact, he passed away in 1861 and was telling her, you got to go to the battlefield. You know, she said, blood of patriots is running in my blood. So it was, yes, absolutely. And she credited her father with giving her abolitionist feelings and patriotic and military kind of feelings. It was absolutely, in fact, one of the things that surprised her, because she was, Massachusetts had a really good educational system in the 1840s. And when she went to New Jersey, she was a little taken aback at how different the education system was there. So it was in many ways a pretty advanced family. For instance, her father was primarily, he was a farmer, he was a businessman in Oxford. He was a good role model in a lot of ways.
I see. Well, my next question is, it has to do with her work with the Red Cross. Some years ago, this is in the 90s, I went to this really nice exhibit down at the National Guard facility in Springfield. I was down there for a appellate court argument or something, I forget. But it was a beautiful exhibit at General Logan. It was a General Logan exhibit, but it had a lot of beautiful artifacts, his saddles, his uniforms and everything, but it had a lot of stuff on Mrs. Logan as well. And I recall from their reference to Mrs. Logan working with Clara Barton in the Red Cross. And I wonder what you know, if anything about that. What role did Mrs. Logan play, if any, with Clara Barton and the Red Cross?
That's a great question. And I got to say, I don't know. And you've intrigued me. It's not surprising that would happen, because a lot of the relationships that were built during the war continued on, right? And they continued on among women as much as they did among the men. I do know that Barton, in the Red Cross years, it was not at all uncommon for women who had worked with her either during the war or elsewhere to team up with her. So it's a very likely sounding story. But
I've never researched it myself, so I don't know. I guess I could too. Yeah. I meant to, in the days leading up tonight, to look up Mrs. Logan, not Clara Barton, but Mrs. Logan, but did not. I just wondered if you knew about it. Yeah. Well, okay, we'll do that. Then just a quick question about somebody else was about to ask that about the Glen Echo location. What's the relationship between that the museum, which you said is at 7th, but what's the exact location of the museum? 7th and...
Oh, it's the streets they were all renumbered. It's
oh, okay.
Let me see if I have it.
Because that's in downtown. That's downtown. That's downtown.
Downtown, yes. It's very close to. In fact, it's on 7th Street, and I want to say, no, I'm not going to say, because
I'm northwest. It's northwest.
It is. It's very close to the National Portrait Gallery.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that would be northwest.
Yes, exactly, which is where actually that building was the U.S. Patent Office. So it would make sense that she was a boarding house very close to.
Right. Yeah, I know where that. But what about this reference always to Glen Echo? She living in the Glen Echo, because it's the neighborhood far away.
I know. Well, that was a house that was built to be both her home and the Red Cross headquarters. And it's a great museum if you've never gone there. And it's like all this, cabinets built in everywhere to store supplies. And it was her home. In fact, the image that I showed of the stained glass windows that have the Red Cross, those are from her home in Glen Echo. And it became her home, but also the home of a lot of Red Cross workers. It was kind of this really wonderful sort of alternate family lifestyle when she was there. And it was built at a time when it actually wasn't difficult to get there. It was right on, I can't remember when the streetcar line came out there, but it was on a streetcar line and certainly very close to railroad stations. So it was not difficult to get into Washington from there. But she never went back to the missing soldiers office. After she came back to found the Red Cross in the United States, she lived elsewhere. She had her own house for a while. And then once the Red Cross work really became in earnest, this house was gifted to.
Yeah, and as many times as I've been to Washington, and I know Glen Echo is a neighborhood of DC, and I know it's on one of the subway lines, but I just can't locate it in my mind. Where would that be in Washington?
Yeah, and I'm gonna I would have to look it up as well, because when I went there, I got lost. My husband brought one when I went there, but one time I was trying to find it and I got lost, and I was trying to find something related to Rachel Carson, and I came at it through the wrong way. So yeah, I'd have to look at it. I'd have to.
I have maps of Washington. I could find it.
I know, right? Can you find it?
Anyway, one last question, or more so a comment that it came to me when you were talking about mourning, the mourning aspect of things. That's a very interesting topic because who is it? All of a sudden, I'm thinking of Drew Gilpin Faust, This Republic of Suffering, and of course the whole cemetery movement of that era that Gary Wills refers to in his book on the Gettysburg Address. Part of it's about Mount Auburn Cemetery, etc., which a lot of us have visited over the years, and how that relates to our current circumstances, where all of us, not just me, I've lost some very close friends, no wakes, no funerals, and how we today, like then, have been prevented from mourning the way people, families did then.
Good point. I haven't made that connection to today, but that's a really
and so how when that Harper's lithograph or whatever it is was shown, that caused me to think of that. That's because people dying far away from home was totally unknown in those days.
Right. And I keep thinking about how when I started researching Clara Barton, and I was specifically interested in her Civil War work, but it was all about the battlefield work. It was all about, the nursing and the supplies. And then there would be, a couple pages at the end. Oh, and then she searched for missing soldiers, partly because of the discovery of the museum and the establishment of the museum. I think that has changed. And there's a lot more recognition now that the work she did at the Missing Soldiers Office, and it was important in setting up the idea that the military has an obligation to the families to know where their soldiers are, because the emotional toll that it takes on families is enormous. I mean, it's not just the emotional toll of sending a loved one to war, or even the toll of sending a loved one to war and then losing them, but to send them to war and lose them and then not get any way to say goodbye, to have closure, to properly mourn it breaks your heart for a lot of these guys.
Yeah, just a small facet of that for me was I remember being in basic training and being so far away from home in the cold and the wet, no contact with family. And my cousin, one of my dear cousins, my closest family member these days, other than my immediate family, was out in that part of the country, out in the Pacific Northwest, and insisted on seeing me at the fort against all the regulations. And I, to this day, always remember having a half hour with somebody, who was very close to me, when otherwise I, didn't have any contact with any family members. And that, how that dovetails with the kind of work that Clara Barton did and how important that was to everybody. She worked with, and the kind of stuff, because she didn't just fix people's wounds. She did a lot more than that. And I think that's very significant part of her work and her legacy, that she saw things in a more holistic way to take care of people's needs beyond just taking care of their wounds. So I've always wanted to meet Clara Barton, and I'm sure glad I did, and I'm sure everybody else is glad too. We had a fantastic program here tonight.
Mark or Leslie?
Yes.
This is Cindy Heckler. Can I tell a quick personal story?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I've heard for years that John Heckler, one of my great, I'm not sure how many great uncles, died at Andersonville. So a couple years ago, I had a chance to go down there and check it out and, go into the visitor center, and they have that nice computer system. And I typed in John Heckler, and up it popped. He was right there. And I thought, oh, I thought this is great. And then I went out to, the funny thing is, and if you don't know, Heckler is Heckler, just like it's said in the papers or on the news all the time. I went out to the headstone and it was there, except on that, they spelled it Hechler. But I don't take that personally. I just thank Clara Barton for the work. And I think the Heckler family owes her many thanks for doing that.
That's amazing. Boy, that's talk about like the personal connection. Wow. Your heart must have just
It
wow.
did. And I have several pictures. So yeah, I was very glad I went.
Cindy, you saved the best for the last. You really did. Seriously, I very good. Well, if there are no more questions or comments,
let me just answer two things. First of all, Vicki was very kind enough to look it up. It's 427 7th Street Northwest, and it was open for visitors on February 15th by appointment, and it has weekly digital programming. It does, and actually some of those programs are fantastic. And then, do I have any book recommendations? I do. The one that there's not a lot of adult biographies of Clara Barton. Clara Barton, Professional Angel, is good, but it's like 2/3 of it is about her life after the Civil War. If you're interested in, wait, I'm going to spell it wrong. If you're interested in what I think is the best biography, there's a book called Woman of Valor by Stephen Oates. And I know Oates. Yeah. But there's also one that came out just recently that I know I have right in front of me, but of course I'm not going to be able to locate it. It's Between the Bullet and the Ballot. Oh, wait, here it is. Here it is. Clara Barton's Civil War, Donald Fan. Between the bullet and the ballot. Between the bullet and the hospital. And this actually just came out. Boy, was it last year? 2000?
Yeah, it's a very recent publication.
2018. I thought it was just last year, so it's 2 years old now. But it actually does a really nice job about putting her work during the Civil War in context of more recent understanding of that kind of work during the war. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that title. I have a slowly but surely expanding a library of Civil War medicine books, and that'll have to be among them. I thank you for the recommendation, and thank you for the program. We had terrific attendance tonight for a terrific program. I don't know how we're going to improve on that, but next month, on March 12th, we will have our 800th meeting
Wow.
with Mr. Biggs. All of a sudden, I can't remember our speaker's name. After tonight, I don't know if we should ever have any more meetings, but we will have to push on. Greg Biggs will deliver the Nevins Freeman address, and it'll be on the Atlanta campaign, and we'll look forward to that. March 12th, Friday night, same time, same station. I thank everyone for being a part of this tonight. It was fantastic, beyond my expectations, which were high in the first place. I've always wanted to meet Clara Barton. I'm so glad I did. So good night to y'all, and good luck to everyone. I will remember this night for a long, 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 long time. Thank you.
Thanks all. Good night.
Good night.